guys, how's it going? My name is Liza. Welcome back to my channel, and today I wanted to do a video about some of the recommendations that I have for Nonfiction November. So I have a list of about 5 books here that I want to talk about, and they're all either within the range of 4 or 5 stars. They're some of my favorite books that I've read when I first got into nonfiction, and they span all the way from like my early 20s up until very recently. So I'm super excited to share these books with you, and I hope that you guys stay tuned. So the first book that I want to talk about is Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. This is a book that I actually read a few years ago, and I absolutely ended up loving it. It follows the story of Trevor Noah as he grows up with a black mom and a white dad, and him trying to figure out his identity as he's growing up in apartheid. The story is very intense, but it's really balanced out well because he tells you about stories from his family, but then you also get the flip side of what's going on in the world with the apartheid and how the government is treating people that are from different races. This book tended to be a bit more intense as far as memoirs go, but I ended up really enjoying it. Trevor Noah does a really good job of being able to balance some of the more difficult parts of living in apartheid with some family humor and some fun stories about his family. So I ended up absolutely loving it, and I gave it a solid 5 out of 5 stars. So the next book that I want to talk about is one that's a little bit more factual, and it hits a little bit more close to home because I drink a lot of coffee. And that's going to be Caffeine, How Caffeine Created the Modern World by Michael Pollen. Now, this was my first book that I ever read by Michael Pollen, and at first I wasn't like super into it. I found it a little bit dense and a little bit fact heavy, but this is a memoir that follows him as he tries to get out of the addiction of caffeine. And he's a journalist, and he starts getting really curious about the effects of caffeine and what it's actually doing to his body. And so he decides to conduct his own experiment where he just completely goes cold turkey without caffeine for, I think it was about a month. During his withdrawal from caffeine, he is simultaneously going and doing interviews with doctors who are an expert in caffeine and how it affects the brain. So I ended up really enjoying it. It was very fact heavy, and I had to be in a very specific mood to be able to read this and retain everything. But I absolutely loved it, and I give it a solid 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I want to talk about with you is Mouse, and this is by Art Spiegelman. I originally read this in a college course that was focused on comics back in my early 20s, and this book became one of my favorite memoirs of all time. This follows the story of Art as he goes to his grandfather's house, and his grandfather talks to him about the Holocaust. Now, Art is a journalist, and he decides to start recording the conversations that he has with his grandfather as they talk in depth about the Holocaust. Every person in this book is represented by an animal, so the Jewish people are mice, the Americans are dogs, and then the Nazis are pigs. One of the reasons why I think that they did the art this way is because it makes the overall story a little bit more digestible. There is a lot of violence in it because it is a memoir, and the grandfather is talking about the horrors leading up to and the horrors inside Auschwitz. And so the fact that everybody is an animal and everybody is kind of personified as an animal makes it a little bit more digestible for people that haven't been through the Holocaust, and it makes it bearable for you to be able to read it. Throughout the story, you get to see the after effects of how the grandfather emotionally handles the Holocaust and how it affected him long term and how it affected his marriage long term. And then with the interviews, you go back in time to see what he actually experienced. So this was my first step into nonfiction, and it's actually the book that got me into reading nonfiction to begin with. And I absolutely loved it. It's one of my favorites, and you should definitely pick it up. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. If you have any interest in history at all, this will light a fire into that passion, and it'll make you want to go and read more history books. So the next book that I want to talk about is a book that I read a few years ago. This was on one of my books that I wanted to read on my bucket list. And this book is Tuesdays with Maury by Mitch, Albo. Now, I had seen a few reviews on YouTube, and that's how I first learned about this book. And it had ranged from this book is extremely depressing to I absolutely love this book. So I decided that I wanted to pick it up and see what all the fuss was about. I ended up being one of the people that absolutely love this book. Now, the subject matter is extremely depressing because you are following Mitch as he's a new journalist and he goes back home and he sees one of his old professors that's slowly dying. He is a journalist, and so he wants to remember different tidbits of his friend's life, and so they start setting up interviews every Tuesday, which is how they got the title Tuesdays with Maury. This was such an insightful book, and it's actually what made me enjoy reading Mitch Albo. He has a very specific way that he writes where the subject matter can be super depressing, but there's always kind of this light at the end of the tunnel, and that's definitely something that you see in Tuesdays with Maury. One of the things that they talk about in the book that I think is really interesting is just life lessons and religion and how you should treat your family and what you should prioritize. Obviously, it's with a grain of salt because not everybody is going to think the same way, but I found that in the interviews, Maury was very insightful, and I was able to see the world in a completely different way after reading this book. If you listen to the audio version of this book, you'll be able to listen to the actual interviews that Mitch and Maury were able to record together. And so I thought that that was really cool. That got me really excited, and it was just a really fun and intimate way to be able to experience the book. But again, I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. I learned so much about life from it, and I definitely think that you should pick it up. So I think that that's it for my recommendations for right now. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!